On March 13th, 1986, in Ohio, a 65-year-old woman named Jane Pritchard was immediately taken into witness protection, having narrowly avoided losing her life. Her treatment since the incident has been incredibly difficult, and she experienced extreme forms of paranoia. Medical professionals also discovered an acute sense of claustrophobia, which was said to be brought on by a secret room in the home where she lived. She was told by her therapist to keep a diary and record her thoughts and feelings, and eventually she consented to sharing these writings with healthcare professionals. These are the truly horrifying details of what she experienced. I vividly remember my first meeting with Paul. My friends Karen and Joanne had asked me to go to a gala at my local country club in Cleveland, Ohio. I was apprehensive about going. You see, they were all married, and I felt like they were inviting me out of pity. But as both a widow and a retired home ec teacher, in the end, it was my loneliness that made my decision about going for me. I loved the outdoors, and there was no denying that the gardens at this club were wonderful. I briefly allowed myself to imagine being a member there and playing tennis and exploring the grounds. The outside of it felt freeing, but the inside felt stifling and claustrophobic. The gala was full of retirees, and the DJ was playing all of the songs that reminded me of my youth: Sinatra, Johnny Cash, Elvis. It was toward the end of the night, when people started dancing in pairs, that things turned sour. I got that painful reminder that my husband Jack was no longer with me. I looked around the crowded room with the strobe lights flashing across the hall and the speakers blaring out the old classics, and I noticed a tall, dark figure coming my way. And he smiled, he held out his hand, and he introduced himself as Paul, and he asked me to dance. While swaying back and forth, he shyly confessed to me that he hadn't asked a lady to dance in 30 years. I told him that he should ask more often, and we laughed together. It was nice to feel noticed, especially as I was so used to going unnoticed. He was very handsome, and I couldn't help but blush beneath the strobe lighting. It really did feel like the old days, that burst of excitement and anticipation when holding hands with a complete stranger. It was electrifying. I instantly sensed a connection, but I also sensed an uneasy feeling. I felt this overwhelming sense of emotion running through me. A powerful sense that I was no longer in control. Now, whether it would cause love or pain, I did not know. All I did know was that I was powerless to do anything about it. At the time, I put these feelings down to my nerves and also my guilt on having moved on from Jack. But in hindsight, I now know I should have listened to that nagging doubt in my gut. After dancing, we sat down by a vacant table and we had a few drinks together. He told me how his wife recently passed away, and I also confided that I was a widow. Paul leaned into me and he said, "My lady's been gone for 10 years. It leaves a great big hole in your heart, and that hole will always be there, but over time, that hole will get smaller and smaller, and things will get that little bit better each day." It was amazing to speak to someone who knew exactly what I was going through. I got sympathy and pitying looks from everyone else, but with Paul, I got empathy. And I found myself ignoring my doubts I had about him because, at the moment, I didn't feel so lonely anymore. And Paul took my hand, he looked directly in my eyes, and he continued, "I don't know about you, but I feel like my wife, Maggie, is still with me. It doesn't feel like she's gone, and that's a good thing too." I gave him my phone number, and I could see my friend smiling at me from the corner of the hall as if we were teenagers again. And to be honest, that's exactly how Paul made me feel. After that, we started dating. He was such a romantic, and he always greeted me with flowers and a kiss on the cheek, and it made me giddy with excitement. But then after 2 months of dating, things became more serious. I awoke in the middle of the night to a broken sink and water shooting everywhere. I couldn't get a plumber at that hour, but I was no good with anything like that. That was Jack's domain, so I was basically clueless as to what to do, and I panicked and I called Paul. But here's the craziest part. Instead of being annoyed at being woken up, he drove straight over and he fixed it in 10 minutes. But on his way out, he noticed a wobbly table leg and he said, "I won't have you eating dinner on this monstrosity. I'll pop by tomorrow and fix this too." Then I jokingly told him that he's my knight in shining armor, to which he responded with a smirk, "Oh, I can put my hands to anything." After that, he came around to my house as much as I did his, and we grew closer. He never stayed over at my house, but I never questioned this, deciding he must have his reasons. And after a year of dating, he asked me to marry him, and I said yes. Me and Paul didn't come from big families, so we had a low-key wedding, and somehow I found myself happily married once again. It was a whirlwind of change that I hoped was for the better, but I never really had time to think about it. I was swept up in the romance of it all and overlooked the fact that I didn't know anything about Paul beyond the surface. We never talked much about our previous marriages. Of course, I was sad about Jack sometimes, but Paul was always so attentive that suddenly I realized I had a whole new life to discover, and we were no longer referred to as widows and widowers and defined by our past. We were now newlyweds, and we were defined by the bright future ahead of us, or at least the bright future that I hoped that we could have. Paul lived outside Cleveland, near Oberlin. It was such an idyllic house, down a country road at the top of a hill with a thatched roof on top. I had visited many times and was thrilled that it was now a place I would move into and I would call home. Paul said that the countryside really inspired him and that since his retirement from carpentry, he wanted to complete a lifelong ambition to write a novel. He converted one of the spare bedrooms into a study and he set daily time aside to fulfill his dream. And I really believed that Paul was more than capable of writing a bestseller. I often think of the Lost Einstein's theory. It argues that some of the greatest minds may have been too busy doing dead-end jobs to properly pursue their dreams. And in the weeks and months that we were together, I noticed how emotionally intelligent Paul was. He could sometimes tell when I was sad or happy without even looking at me. I thought this was the hallmark of a great writer, as he could see deeper inside the human soul than most anyone. What I didn't know was that something horrific lurked in the deep. What I later learned is that the human soul is not always used for good. Seemingly good people can be profoundly bad. But Paul took his writing incredibly seriously, to the extent that he made me put my hands in his, look in the eye, and vow that I would never go into his study. He said it was because that he had gotten a room just so, and he didn't want any creative disruptions. Back then, I respected his wishes mostly out of love and support, but there was a part of me that respected his wishes out of fear. When he was writing, I often went for a walk or read in one of the many nooks of the house. It was a wonderful house, all except for the living room, which I found rather creepy. By the fireplace was Paul's favorite rifle, and hanging across the wall were the antlers and heads of deers he had captured while out shooting in Wellington, some of which were just fawns. I always loved the outdoors, and my father had enjoyed hunting, but with the intention of hunting for food and survival. Paul looked to be hunting out of pride. I looked straight into the fawn's bloodshot eyes and gaping mouth, wondering how those last moments might have felt. Paul was so kind and compassionate, and yet he displayed his kills like trophies for all to see. The dead animals made me feel uncomfortable, but I kept quiet about it, telling myself I couldn't expect all of my likes and his likes to align. One day, when Paul was out of the house running errands, I was cleaning when I walked straight into a silky cobweb. My heart began to pound and my throat swelled from fear. I flinched and I spun around, knowing that cobwebs meant one thing: spiders. I hated those spindly-legged things more than anything else, and always had. When I saw it crawling up my arm of my cardigan, the scream I emitted was so piercing it caused my whole body to tremble. I flung it off me. I watched it fly through the air in a blur of black. Then I disappeared into the closest room, slamming the door behind me and leaning against it in a complete panic. It was only as I began to calm down and look around that I realized where my fear had led me. Paul's study. I felt like I was betraying Paul's trust, but the thought of that spider still being out there made me stay where I was. I still felt an itching across my arm as if it was still there. As I stopped there, ruled by my phobia, I couldn't help but realize just how unusual the study looked. It was far different than what I had imagined. There were papers scattered across the desk, but not many. Paul had been working on this novel almost every day for a full year and had very little to show for it. I checked the drawers and I expected a huge manuscript to be in there, but there was nothing. So I figured he kept it hidden away. There was no typewriter there, and not even a pen. I started to feel really guilty for spending so long snooping around, but then I heard a noise. It was either a scrape or a scratch, I couldn't tell which. Coming from behind the wall were the spine-curling sounds of fingernails or paws of another creature. Something was striking against the wall as if it was their only form of communication. The scratches and scrapes were getting weaker and weaker, as if they were the last cries for help. I rubbed my head, wondering, was I imagining these sounds? I told myself it was an old house, so it was probably nothing. Thoughts I didn't truly believe, but I could still hear these sounds echoing in my mind, desperately yearning for an answer. I noticed that there were marks on the paintwork of the wall by the bookcase as if it had been moved. Before I could stop myself, I used my full strength to shift the bookcase to the right. What I saw there made me gasp in confused dread. There was an outline of a closed door with no handle. It could have been easily overlooked if it wasn't for that rusty padlock on it. I wanted answers as much as I wanted to live in denial about it all. I thought I knew my husband, so why did he have a secret locked room in a part of the house that he made me swear not to go into? I traced my shaky fingers across the padlock, wondering what any of this meant. And that's when I heard the familiar sound of Paul's pickup truck parked up on the driveway. I fell onto the bookshelf with fright, causing a brass candle holder to fall and the base snapping in two. I quickly moved the bookcase back. I positioned the candle holder in such a way that I hoped that damage would go unnoticed. And then I hurried outside of that study. I silently closed the study door and I shuffled along the hallway. I was so anxious about it all, I didn't even think to check for the spider anymore. When Paul walked into the kitchen and gave me a kiss, he immediately sensed that something was wrong with me. With wide eyes, he asked, "Is everything okay, honey?" I stumbled and I said, It's nothing. I saw a spider earlier and now I'm so worried that it's still on me. I remember my late husband Jack would laugh at me for my fear of spiders. Paul, meanwhile, inspected my cardigan, gave me the all clear, and then hugged me. He also offered to check the entire house for spiders. As he went off to search for them, I started preparing dinner and I collected my thoughts. Walking back into the kitchen, Paul stretched his arms out and said, "Well, I've searched top to bottom for you and it looks like there's no spiders around, but I'll keep an eye out." As I looked at my caring husband, I felt bad for thinking the worst of him. Perhaps that secret room was merely somewhere for him to store his valuables. As I washed carrots in the sink and I looked out of the window and lovingly watched Paul in the yard chopping some wood for the fire, I saw his hands lift up the axe and chop the pieces of wood into smithereens, bit by bit, one mighty blow after the next. He had this gaze in his bloodshot eyes that I'd never seen before, as if he was realizing this deep-seated anger onto the wood. As I watched him, I realized that I was seeing a new side to him, one that I didn't much like. I felt like I was truly seeing him. I panicked and I wondered if he had found the broken candle holder and if he knew that I knew about the secret room. I couldn't help but be quiet and on edge, behavior that, despite my best efforts, did not go unnoticed by Paul. As we got ready for bed, he smiled at me and he said, "Jane, is everything okay? You seem distracted today." I told him that I was feeling tired, and he replied, "Yeah, me too. I need to be up early tomorrow morning. I'm going to work on the book." I started to question everything. Maybe I had been lied to the whole time. Maybe writing his book, that's code for something else. Something so dark I could never see the light again. The more and more I thought about this, the more and more I could hear those scratching sounds from before. That night, I found it difficult sleeping next to him. He was my husband, yet it felt like he was a complete stranger. I didn't want to be in this home anymore. I didn't want to be out in the Ohio boonies. I didn't want this life anymore. But what choice did I have? Laying awake at night, I could still hear the scratching noises that I heard before. Those noises were now imprinted in my brain. Noises that wouldn't go away. This was the first time that I ever truly felt terrified of Paul. But other moments started to come back to me, scraping at my brain. I remembered that time he got furious at a waitress for getting his food wrong, and the terrified look on the gas station attendant's face when she gave him the incorrect change. There were anger issues there that maybe I consciously and subconsciously didn't want to resurface, but I didn't want any of this anymore. As I heard the wind howling from outside, I started to doze off. I felt my mind drifting and drifting, and then I felt it violently spin out of control. I was no longer forming coherent thoughts, and my mind was now a foggy mist, dashing from one worry to the next. I could feel my heartbeat thump faster and faster, and while my body began to shiver, I could feel Paul's cold body brush next to me, and his musky breath pressing against my neck. I started to focus on sleeping and letting my mind rest, until I heard a firm, gripping motion on my neck. It was Paul. He wanted to strangle me. I instantly screamed. Paul stroked my hair as he calmly said, "Jane, you're having a nightmare. I wanted to wake you up." I saw him smile, and he kissed me on the forehead. I muttered, "Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know what's come over me." Paul then said, "Don't apologize, please. Just get some rest. I'll tiptoe when I'm up early tomorrow morning, and I'll be as quiet as a mouse." He then kissed me goodnight, and I managed to put everything at the back of my mind, and I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I had not fully awakened, and my eyes were still shut, and then, as the sunlight pressed against my closed eyes, I opened them and I could see Paul walking by the foot of the bed, sneaking towards me. This was it. Last night was a failure. Now was his chance. He was going to wait until the early hours of the morning when he knew I was still asleep, and then make his move. I heard the scraping of metal, the sharpening of a knife, and footsteps coming closer and closer. And I screamed louder than I ever had before. Paul said, "Sorry, I'm sorry." I looked over at Paul and I saw him carrying a tray of blueberry pancakes and a coffee pot. He had spent the morning making me my favorite breakfast. I felt like such an idiot. Paul left me on my own with blueberry pancakes, and as the sweet taste filled my mouth, I wondered whether I had gotten him completely wrong. He had been nothing but kind to me, and now my paranoia was causing me to treat his kindness with suspicion. But the doubts were still there in the back of my mind, nagging away at me. We never talked about our previous marriage, but why the hell not? It seemed nice that we had put our past behind us, but at the same time, it seemed strange to never manage to talk about the people we spent over 30 years together with, who shaped us into who we are today. There were certain occasions when I mentioned Maggie and he immediately changed the subject, but not in a mournful way, but in a way in which he had something to hide. He never talked much about his carpentry days either, which also took place for over 3 decades of his life. At first, I thought that it was brilliant, and I loved having a man around the house who was good with his hands, but then I realized Paul built the very house I'm living in. This land was given to him by his father, and he just built an entire house from scratch. So that secret room was something he made, or something he added to the house. I remember those words he said to me when fixing my sink. "I can put my hands to anything." I didn't know what to do that day, so I went down to the library. I told Paul that I wanted to check on a few books, but I didn't tell him exactly what books. When I was in the study, I recall 3 books lying on the bookshelf: The Shadowed Footprint by Tom Barkley, The Demented Demon by Aaron Wolfe, and The Drifting Fog by Warren S. Kroenke. I looked at the back covers of all 3 in the library. All of them were thrillers, and all of them involved men violently pursuing women and living out their darkest fantasies. What did this all mean? And later that afternoon, I got back and I noticed a note on the kitchen table. It read, "Hey Jane, getting the pickup fixed. Be gone a couple hours. As always, with love, Paul." I decided it was now or never. I went out to the backyard and I looked in Paul's toolbox, and I found a pair of cable cutters and brought them inside the house. I walked down the hallway and I took a long, deep breath, and I opened the door of the study and I saw the same near-empty room as before, and a bookcase. I scanned my eyes over it, noticing something was missing, but taking a moment to realize what. It was the broken candlestick holder. It had gone. This meant Paul knew I'd been there. Knowing I had to act fast, I shifted the bookcase to the side, and I heard the scratches that I had heard before, echoing within the walled prison, and I took the cable cutters, and with all of my strength, I cut off that padlock. I opened the door to that secret room, and I stared into the darkness, the light from the study pulling in after me. Lying against the wall was a woman covered in dirt and cobwebs. Her hands were tied behind her back and spiders were crawling within her hair. I knew that face. And then I remembered the first time that I met Paul at the dinner dance and the words he said to me. I feel like my wife Maggie is still with me. And he was right, but it wasn't a feeling. Looking at her, I mouthed, Maggie? And I saw the fear in her blinking eyes as they adjusted to the light, and then her eyes looked beyond me as if to signal something was behind. I turned around and I saw Paul looming over me, the broken candle holder clutched in his right hand, and he looked at me with a charming smile, but his bloodshot eyes full of hatred, and said, My dear Jane, if only you had listened to me, and then our ending could have been so very different. I charged forward, but he pushed me backward. He closed the door behind me and left me there in the darkness where cobwebs stuck to my skin. Spiders scuttled across me, and the walls devoured my desperate whimpers. A search went on for Jane, where Paul played the innocent victim and received mounds of support from the community. Several months passed by, and Paul published a best-selling book about his experience, how he felt that despite the fact that Jane was missing, he refused to believe that he was widowed once again and never gave up hope. Paul became a town hero until a local journalist did some digging about Paul's first wife, Maggie, how she died under suspicious circumstances, and how she was quickly cremated after her death, and how, like Jane, she didn't come from a big family either, and, as such, didn't have a lot of people looking for her. This reporter eventually tracked down another ex-girlfriend of Paul's named Brenda. Brenda was nervous talking about Paul, but eventually spoke of how he would use superficial charm to emotionally manipulate her. She then confided that he was once physically abusive, and she was too afraid to go to the cops. This new information presented police with a reasonable suspicion to investigate Paul. The police searched the house but found nothing. That is, until they walked around the back. They noticed an enclosure of the house that they had never been to, and how the back of the study did not fully reach the back of the house. Perhaps it was intuition or instinct, but an unnamed officer decided to press his ears against the wall, and he heard those same scratching and scraping and the weakened sounds of creatures in trouble. Paul was in the house talking to an officer, but the officer didn't want to get a warrant and instead was motivated by this sudden, intense desire to save someone or something in trouble. He went into Paul's tool shed and he took out a sledgehammer. He shouted, Keep away from the walls, I'm coming. And then he plowed through those bricks, bit by bit. Then, through the rubble, he saw two frightened faces huddled together, covered in dirt and cobwebs. The secret room was no longer a secret. Maggie recovered in the hospital, and when she was well enough, she changed her name and she moved away, desperate to flee the ghosts of her past. On escaping, Jane never feared spiders again. She now knew who the real monsters were and proposed a new theory to the entire world: the Lost Hitler's theory. The idea that some of the most evil minds in the world have just been too busy to fulfill their dreams. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.